Well, good morning. It's a little bit earlier in the morning than usual for me, and driving, as you can tell from it's a little earlier from the darkness, but also outside, there's fog all around, and it's probably a very opportune moment to discuss the fog around enterprise architecture that can quite often happen within, and actually I'd probably say most often happen within an organization. So when we think about scatter architecture and we try and understand what all is meant by that term, and architecture, IT architecture, enterprise IT architecture, and those are all various terms that can be very well defined in some kind of a glossary because people are always looking for them. However, you can just go to Wikipedia and take up a good look at that as well. But let's just sort of put this all into context. And the IT architecture, back, and this goes back to the mid 90s, and I coined a phrase in a company I was working in called RAID. And what was happening is we were doing RAD back then, which is rapid application development. Some were successful, but quite a few had some colossal failures. And a lot of the failures dealt with the inability to scale wide, meaning across the business or outside of the particular little group within the business, and the inability of a RAD developed application to scale deep. In other words, to scale across the volumes of the enterprises, across networks. And so this inability to really deal with architecture is where I coined the phrase RAID, which was a play on RAD. And what RAID stood for, of course, is Rapid Architected Iterative Development. So iterations are great, and I am, my leanings from years gone by were that iterations are your best way to get the loop within the customer base and the requirements and the techie guys, and so that you didn't go off and build something for a year and then show it to the users and then it's like, oh my god, what is this? So the fundamentals of iterations or sprints or whatever we want to call it, all of them I still firmly believe need to be done within the context of an architecture. And when we look today where architecture, from the EA enterprise architecture perspective comes into play, really what we want to be able to see is that no longer do we just think in terms of will it fit within my IT architecture, but will it fit within my business? So is this a solution that can move up across the business? And then typically, again, we want to look at it and we say, okay, how does my business work? What's the best way for my business to work? What is the core aspects of my business? And so we want to be able to have this business architecture in play so that when we look at the way that we're going to automate the business, we're actually automating business that should exist, as opposed to having duplication or silos, and maybe the silos make sense and the silos are there for security reasons, specialty skills. It could be, for example, that we want to arbitrate across different labor pools, or we want to have closeness to the customer to optimize customer presence or delivery costs, or it might be you're in a service industry where you need to have your services local, or it might be food industry where you want to have freshness. You might need to position aspects of your business where it makes sense to raw materials. So there's a number of factors that can determine whether or not silos are good or bad. But in general, we tend to think that a siloed organization is a bad thing. So one of the, we could look at a number of the things that an enterprise architecture would seek to uncover to raise the dialogue on the business level as to whether or not these things should exist or are optimal to exist within the organization. And again, that's part of architecture. So we could look at scatter as being a deployment technique for business and IT within an architected enterprise. And some of these may be done in short iterations, in long iterations, and maybe the term RAID doesn't really come into play when we talk about scatter, but I wanted to share that because it's one of those fundamentals that's sort of stuck in the back of my mind as the necessities for architecture.